Hello, and welcome to History 300, the origins of the First World War. Lecture 6, the arms race and the military strategies of the great powers. In August 1898, the Russian foreign minister sent out a diplomatic note addressed to the leaders of all the other great powers, imploring them to put an end to these incessant armaments and to seek the means of warding off the calamities which are threatening the whole world. He went on, "The intellectual and physical strength of the nations, labour and capital, are for the major part diverted from their natural application and unproductively consumed. Hundreds of millions are devoted to acquiring terrible engines of destruction." This initiative, at the bequest of his ruler, Tsar Nicholas II, led to the 1899 and 1907 disarmament conferences at The Hague in Holland. Though the conferences produced many fine words, however, they had little practical effect. By the beginning of the 20th century, the European great powers were unquestionably in an arms race against one another, and the pace of that race was only getting more intense in the years immediately before 1914. Between 1903 and 1908, the total defence spending of the great powers increased by 6.4%. But between 1908 and 1913, it increased by almost 40%. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, later blamed this arms race directly for the outbreak of the First World War. The enormous growth of armaments in Europe, the sense of insecurity and fear caused by them, it was these that made war inevitable, he said. In this lecture, we will examine the growth of the military forces of the great powers in the years immediately preceding the First World War, and what their generals and admirals proposed to do with them if and when war broke out. Before 1870, European wars had usually begun in leisurely style. It might be weeks or even months before the two sides actually put their armies into the field. But all this changed with the spectacular German victory over France in 1870 and 1871. German success in that war was ascribed to the rapid and meticulously planned mobilization of its armies immediately following the declaration of hostilities. The other great powers took note of this and adapted their own war plans accordingly. The onus now was placed on speed and organization in army mobilization. Future wars would be decided, it was thought, in their first days, perhaps even their first hours. Getting the drop on your enemy was the key. Armies were also getting much bigger than they had ever been before, and military service had become a primary responsibility of active male citizenship. After 1870, all of the great powers, except Great Britain, called up young civilian conscripts for between 1 and 6 years of military training. On their release back to civilian life, these young men remained reservists for several years. And if their states ever went to war, they were to be recalled to their regiments during the mobilization process. This meant that the peacetime standing armies of the continental great powers were only a kernel of the massive force that would actually be deployed in a war. When it mobilized in summer 1914, Germany went from having an 840,000-strong peacetime army to an army of 4 million soldiers in a matter of just 300 hours. The mobilization process involved several steps. It typically began with a period preparatory to war, or a pre-mobilization stage. During this pre-mobilization, there would be a call-up of reservists in critical border regions, as well as key personnel who would be needed for administering the main mobilization. Naval vessels would return to harbour, furloughs would be suspended in the military, suspected foreign spies who were being watched by the security services would be arrested. Any money or other valuable assets being held in border regions vulnerable to invasion would be removed to safety. Harbours would be mined, explosives would be placed on key bridges and tunnels, ready for destruction if necessary to obstruct enemy invaders. The army would make a bulk purchase of the horses and the wagons it would need for supply purposes. Railroad stock would be commandeered. Then, once general mobilization itself was declared, there would be announcements in the press and posters distributed in public places, indicating that reservists should report immediately to their barracks. There, uniforms, equipment and weapons would be distributed to them. Their units would be assigned to railroad stations where they would be picked up by troop trains and deposited to wherever they were needed. The whole process was enormously complex and involved precise coordination. The German mobilization plan involved 715,000 horses and 11,000 troop trains, each train pulling more than 50 wagons full of soldiers, horses and supplies. The railroad timetables necessary to coordinate this immensely intricate act had been compiled in great detail years before. Once begun, it was very difficult to disguise the process of mobilization from one's enemies, though attempts were made, especially in the early pre-mobilization stages, to remain surreptitious. It was also very difficult to stop the process once it was begun. Halting halfway through would cause chaos and leave the power in question dangerously exposed to attack. The generals of all the powers were insistent that once the decision to mobilize had begun, events were in their hands, not the hands of civilian politicians, nor even the hands of the royal heads of state. Hence, some commentators, such as the British historian A.J.P. Taylor, have claimed that the First World War began as a war by timetable, that once the mobilization orders had been given out, it became impossible to stop them. Let's look at what each of the great powers planned to actually do with the armies and, in some cases, navies, once they had mobilized them. Let's look at Germany first. The German army's plans from 1894 onwards were shaped by the existence of the Franco-Russian alliance. The German General Staff had to assume that in any great war it would have to fight both France and Russia simultaneously. But it feared that in a long war, Germany could not prevail against both of them. Hence, there was a need to defeat its two enemies in detail, to concentrate against one of them initially, to crush it, and then to turn against the other. This suited the Schwerpunkt, concentration principle beloved of Prussia's military men. Early German plans presumed that it would be best to attack Russia first. But this changed in 1905 when Count Alfred von Schlieffen, the chief of the German General Staff, decided to radically rethink Germany's entire strategy. Schlieffen believed that Russia was simply too large for a quick, decisive victory to be possible. Even if they were successful, Germany's armies would find themselves advancing across hundreds of miles of empty Russian territory, being sucked eastwards into the Russian interior, in the same way that Napoleon's armies had been. Also, Russia was not so immediate a threat to Germany as France, because the large but old-fashioned and ungainly Russian army would take longer to mobilize than France's, and thus could safely be ignored for longer. Schlieffen proposed that if war broke out, 90% of the German army should immediately be sent westwards against France, with just a tiny covering force left in East Prussia to defend against the Russians. Now, Schlieffen knew that it would be difficult to force a quick victory directly across the relatively short Franco-German frontier. Germany's army was larger than France's, but not that much larger. And besides, the border between the two countries was defended by a series of powerful fortresses, which would take time to overcome. So Schlieffen proposed entering France not head-on, but through its northern flank, specifically by invading Belgium and sending the mass of his forces around and behind the French army instead of straight into it. The idea was to envelop the French in a huge pocket and crush them from the side and the rear. Schlieffen hoped that this might be possible in a mere 40 days. I should mention here that there's recently been an argument amongst some military historians as to whether this ever really was Count von Schlieffen's plan at all, or whether it was a plan that his successor as chief of the German General Staff, Helmut von Moltke, came up with after Schlieffen retired. David Fromkin refers to this controversy in his book. For our purposes, however, it doesn't really matter whether the so-called Schlieffen plan was actually cooked up by Schlieffen or not. What matters is that, whosever brainchild it was, by 1914 it was the strategic plan which the German army was committed to. There are two critical points to note about the Schlieffen plan. One is that, by its very nature, it made German military mobilization different from that of any of the other great powers. In every other case, mobilization did not necessarily mean war. That is to say, at the end of general mobilization, the armies of all the other great powers would still be standing in their own territory, waiting for the order to advance. They would not have violated any other country's sovereignty, or committed any overtly warlike act. there would still be the possibility of a negotiated stand-down. The Schlieffen Plan was different. Because of the need for maximum possible speed, invasion was actually built into the mobilization orders itself. On day one of general mobilization, German troops were timetabled to occupy Luxembourg. On day 3, they would cross the frontier into Belgium and begin operations against the Belgian fortress complex at Liège, so as to secure a crossing of the River Meuse. Once the Kaiser had proclaimed general mobilization, in other words, Germany was committed to violence against its neighbours. There was no turning back. The other critical point is that any attack on neutral Belgium would violate a non-aggression treaty against that country that Prussia had signed, along with all the other great powers, in 1839, including Britain. If Germany invaded Belgium, it was quite likely that Britain would regard this as a direct threat to its own security. Belgium's geographical position on the English Channel made it a prime starting point for any German invasion of southern England, so the British regarded Belgium's neutrality as essential to its own defence. Both Schlieffen and Moltke were well aware of this, but don't seem to have regarded it as very important, because from their point of view, it wouldn't make much difference to the conduct of operations against France. Britain only possessed a small professional army in peacetime, and could not send more than just a few thousand men to France or Belgium in the opening weeks of a war, far too small of a force to affect the outcome of the Schlieffen Plan. Once France was defeated, the German generals figured the British would see sense and make peace. This assumed, however, that France would be defeated, according to Schlieffen's timetable. What if it wasn't? Then British entry into the war would have profound repercussions, because the British Royal Navy would be able to seal off Germany from trade with the rest of the world. At the very least, this was worth seriously thinking about. Yet the remarkable thing is that at no point did the German General Staff ever try to seriously coordinate its plans with the German Foreign Office. The German Chancellor in 1914, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, hadn't even known of the existence of the Schlieffen Plan until a year before. And judging by his behaviour during the July crisis, he doesn't seem to have really understood its implications even then. The fact that Germany's generals were so dismissive of crucial political questions, like Britain's attitude towards Belgian neutrality, says a lot about the lack of serious critical thinking that existed amongst the German ruling elite. Inasmuch as anyone in Berlin was thinking about Britain's posture in a future war, it was the German Navy, led by the Naval Secretary of State Alfred von Tirpitz. German naval policy was supposed to guarantee British neutrality in the event of a continental war. Since 1898, under the Kaiser's direction, Germany had been building a large, modern battle fleet in the North Sea. The idea was not to actually create a larger navy than the Royal Navy. That the Germans knew was unrealistic. But Tirpitz proposed the creation of something he called a risk fleet. The idea was to create a German fleet which, even though it was smaller than Britain's, was large enough to pose a serious threat to the Royal Navy if the two ever engaged in all-out combat. The Germans assumed that the British would not be willing to risk the loss of their North Sea fleet in such an encounter, and so, the theory went, the British would stay out of any war between France and Germany. The problem with the risk fleet strategy was that it assumed that once Britain saw Germany building up its own fleet, it would passively acquiesce to the situation. Instead, what actually happened was quite the opposite. Rather than concede their supremacy in the North Sea, the British began aggressively building up their own fleet to keep ahead of the Germans. Thus began what became known as the Anglo-German naval race. In order to free up resources to concentrate on the German threat in the North Sea, the British began making deals with other rival powers, first Japan, then France, then Russia. In other words, far from neutralising the threat of British intervention in a continental war, the risk fleet strategy actually made it more likely. It was a spectacularly counterproductive bit of German thinking. Let's move on to consider some of the strategic plans of the other great powers. Since conflict with Serbia seemed the most likely way in which Austria-Hungary would find itself embroiled in another war, its military planners, led by Franz Conrad von Hertzendorf, built their assumptions around that possibility. Austria-Hungary assumed two theoretical scenarios. Either the empire would be at war with Serbia alone, or else it would be in a war with Serbia supported by Russia. The Imperial Mobilization Plan tried to accommodate for both of these possibilities. If Austria-Hungary only had to fight Serbia, Conrad proposed sending 3 of the Empire's armies to the Balkans and 3 to the northeastern province of Galicia to defend against a possible Russian intervention. This was called Plan B for Balkans. If Conrad had to face a Russian threat, he proposed switching to Plan R and sending 4 armies to Galicia and just 2 to the Serbian frontier. The Austrians assumed, however, that the defence of Galicia would just be precautionary, because, in the event of war with Russia, its ally Germany would surely send most of its army eastwards into Poland to keep the Russians busy. Wouldn't it? Yes, just as they didn't tell their own civilian colleagues what they were planning, the German chiefs of the General Staff never got round to fully explaining the Schlieffen Plan to their Austrian allies either. This caused no end of panic in August 1914, when it suddenly dawned on Berlin and Vienna that their war plans were completely uncoordinated. Russia and France did a rather better job of coordinating a joint Allied strategy. By 1914, Russia had committed itself to launching an offensive against Germany in the opening days of any great continental war. They recognised, even if the Austrians did not, that Germany was likely to attack west rather than east if war broke out, and that it would be necessary to pose as big a threat to East Prussia as possible so as to take some pressure off the French. The big issue with Russia was the speed of its mobilisation. The Russian army in the past had been notoriously slow to move. However, by 1914, thanks to French capital investment in the railroad system in Poland, the mobilisation plan was significantly faster than it had once been. It was estimated that it would take around 27 days to fully mobilise the Russian army. This was a lot slower than the German mobilisation plan, which only took around 14 days to complete, but still it was a significant speed up, and this narrowing of the gap between their mobilisation rates caused great anxiety in Berlin. The French, for their part, had a pretty good idea that they would be Germany's main target on the outbreak of war. They didn't have a full grasp of how the Schlieffen Plan would work. Obviously the details were top secret. They suspected that the Germans might try to come through Belgium, but they thought that this outflanking movement would be less ambitious than it actually was, and that the Germans would only seize southern Belgium south of the River Meuse. So they didn't make any elaborate plans to defend northern France. In any case, the French General Staff under Joseph Joffre was far more interested in its own offensive plan. In the event of war, the bulk of the French army intended to steamroller its way into the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, just across the Franco-German frontier. Assuming this head-on confrontation was victorious, and of course the French took that eventuality for granted, then they would march onto Berlin, meet up with the Russians advancing from the east, and force a humiliating peace on the Germans, just as France had been humiliated in 1871. The British war plan in 1914 was different from that of all the other great powers, because as an island nation, Britain didn't need to immediately consider the possibility of an overland invasion. The defence of the United Kingdom was in the hands of the Royal Navy, and the British Admiralty assumed that if war broke out with Germany, then the two countries' rival fleets would meet up somewhere in the middle of the North Sea, fight a titanic battle, and the British would, of course, emerge victorious. This plan assumed that if war broke out, the weaker German fleet would be willing to meekly emerge from its home base in order to be annihilated on schedule, something that didn't turn out to be the case. What to do with Britain's small land army was more complex. The Royal Navy proposed that it should be transported to the Frisian Islands along the German North Sea coast, or perhaps Germany's Baltic coastline on the other side of the Danish peninsula, in order to threaten Tirpitz's ships from the land. But since 1905, the army's leaders had been in secret talks with their French military counterparts and had drawn up a quite different plan. They had agreed to send most of the troops to northern France to defend the left flank of the French line. Remember that the French did not expect this area to be a major battlefront. The presence of the British was supposed to be largely for symbolic purposes. However, it's important to re-emphasise that Britain had no treaty obligation to actually carry out this plan in the event of war. Indeed, most of the members of the British government in 1914 were not even aware of its existence, because Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, had not told them. He suspected, probably rightly, that they would have opposed it because it seemed to lock Britain into an alliance commitment to France, regardless of the lack of an official Anglo-French treaty. That then was the state of military preparedness on the eve of the July crisis. To what extent were the great powers confident about their chances if war broke out in 1914? In some ways, they were very confident. This wasn't just national chauvinism, though that was certainly part of it. There was also a belief amongst military men in 1914 that in another war, an army taking the offensive would be much stronger than an army that merely remained on the defensive. War, in their view, was largely a matter of willpower, of guts. The spirit of the offensive, the élan vital, as the French called it, would win the day. This was a fantastic misunderstanding of the state of military affairs in 1914. In fact, as all the armies would soon discover to their shock, the weapons of 1914, rifles, artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, had made defenders much stronger than attackers. But if it was a tragic delusion, it was a tragic delusion shared by almost everyone. So on the one hand, there was a good deal of confidence. Yet in another way, there was anxiety amongst the general staffs. An anxiety not about what would happen if a war broke out, but on the contrary, what would happen if a war did not break out. By 1914, the arms race between the great powers was costing each country more and more each year. Just to keep up with your enemies was absorbing a greater and greater amount of money. Some powers were much more capable of doing this than others. The Germans, in particular, found the financial side of the arms race troubling, because even though Germany had the most dynamic economy in Europe in 1914, the ability of the German government to raise revenue was very constrained. When the German Empire had been established in 1871, the new federal government in Berlin had only been allowed very limited powers for revenue collection, having to rely mostly on indirect taxes like customs tariffs rather than a direct income tax. This meant that even though Germany was an enormously wealthy country, its government's ability to tap that wealth was highly constrained. The decision after 1898 to build up a navy as well as an army placed the imperial treasury under enormous strain. Funding for the armed forces was one of the few areas in which the imperial parliament, the Reichstag, had any powers, and most of its members, even those who were otherwise enthusiastic about military power, were highly resistant to the idea of expanding the government's revenue-collecting powers. By 1914, then, many leaders in Berlin were worried that if the arms race against France and Russia continued for much longer, then Germany would soon reach a point of financial exhaustion. A window of opportunity existed to act against the Franco-Russian alliance that was quickly shrinking. If there was going to be a war, it would be much better to start it now rather than wait 4 or 5 years, by which time Germany's relative position would be much weaker. Some historians have suggested, therefore, that army leaders like Moltke saw the July crisis as an opportunity rather than a threat, a chance to preemptively begin a continental war while Germany still had the upper hand against its enemies. If this was actually the case, then that would lend powerful weight to the argument that Germany was primarily to blame for the outbreak of war in 1914. That's a claim we'll have to weigh up in the weeks to come. Having said that, however, it's also important to remember that the existence of an arms race does not necessarily make a war inevitable. The history of the Cold War is the principal example from our own time. Even though the USA and the USSR built up devastating nuclear arsenals against one another, in the end, thankfully, they were never used. An arms race can end in conflict, but it can also end with one side deciding to peacefully quit. Essentially, that's what happened at the end of the 1980s. The Soviets, faced with rising domestic dissatisfaction at home, decided that the cost of maintaining their vast military forces was simply becoming unsustainable, and they tacitly abandoned the race with the Americans. It's entirely possible that had the July crisis not brought war about in 1914, then the arms race in Europe would have ended with a similarly peaceful resolution. We simply don't know for sure. Apart from the arms race, it's often been suggested that rivalry over overseas imperialism drew the European great powers towards war. In the next lecture, we'll consider the role of imperialism in precipitating a conflict in 1914. See you then.